If a single stray round from a scout's rifle punctures the steel skin of the tank in front of you, it won't explode into a fireball of steel and oil. It will hiss, collapse into a heap of painted rubber, and reveal to the thousands of soldiers watching from the woods that you are standing in front of nothing but air. The cold wind across the French countryside does not carry the scent of pine or damp earth, but the faint, metallic tang of ozone and the rhythmic thrum of an approaching mechanical beast. You are standing in a shallow trench, your fingers white-knuckled around a rifle that feels suspiciously light, because it is. Behind you, the silhouettes of 30 Sherman tanks stand tall against the moonlight, their barrels pointed toward the tree-line where the adversary waits. But there is a terrifying secret buried in the mud of this silent field. The clock is ticking, the sound of real enemy armor is growing louder, and your only defense against a massive division is a collection of balloons and a set of speakers. This is not a drill, it is a high-stakes gamble where the currency is human life and the house always knows when you are bluffing. Jack, a 22-year-old illustrator who just months ago was sketching fashion advertisements in a plush Manhattan studio, wipes cold sweat from his brow. His hands, once used to the delicate touch of charcoal and vellum, are now stained with industrial adhesive and olive drab paint. He looks at his fingernails, permanently blackened by the chemicals used to patch rubber seams, and wonders how his life became a theater of the absurd. Beside him in the foxhole is Miller, a sound technician who used to mix recordings for radio dramas. They aren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They are the architects of a grand lie, members of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. For decades, the records of this unit remained locked in a vault, buried under layers of classification that even high-ranking officials couldn't penetrate. They were known as the Ghost Army, 1,100 men whose primary objective was to be seen when they should have been invisible, and to be heard when they should have been silent. They were recruited from the elite design schools of New York and Philadelphia, told their mission would be dangerous, but never warned they would be expected to fight a war using the tools of a stage magician. The air in the command tent is thick with the smell of stale coffee and charcoal. Jack hunches over a drafting table, his hands trembling as he perfects the shadow on a piece of plywood. In the moonlight, this board must look like the heavy steel plating of a supply truck. Every brushstroke is a matter of survival. The pressure is immense because they are operating in the gap between reality and perception. If the shadow is too dark, a reconnaissance pilot will spot the inconsistency. If it is too light, the illusion fails. They were tasked with creating a phantom force of 30,000 soldiers out of thin air. They had to simulate the chaos, the noise, and the physical presence of two entire divisions, all while knowing that if the deception was uncovered, they would be utterly defenseless. A single German patrol stumbling into their perimeter wouldn't find a battalion of infantry, they would find a group of artists with paintbrushes and air pumps. The tension of this realization hangs over them like a shroud. Jack often catches himself staring at the tanks, waiting for them to move, almost convinced by his own deception. The deception was a threefold symphony of lies coordinated with surgical precision, and tonight, the first layer is being tested to its breaking point. Huge, inflatable rubber tanks, planes, and trucks are deployed under the cover of night. From a distance or from the air, these decoys are indistinguishable from the real thing. Jack watches as a four-man team carries a tank into position. It's a surreal sight, four men lifting a 30-ton war machine as if it were a mattress. To add to the realism, they use bulldozers to create fake track marks in the mud, leading toward the rubber tanks to suggest heavy movement. They hang laundry, light small cooking fires, and move about the camp in a way that mimics the mundane routines of a massive army. But the visual is only the beginning. The eyes can be deceived, but the ears are much harder to fool. Every movement must be calculated. If a soldier is seen lifting a corner of a tank to adjust its position, the lie is dead. Deep in the woods, Miller oversees the second layer, the sonic deception. Massive speakers, each weighing 500 pounds and capable of projecting sound for 15 miles, are mounted on the backs of half-tracks. These aren't just any sounds. They are high-fidelity recordings of tank engines, the clanking of treads, and the muffled shouts of men at work, captured months earlier back in the States. Miller adjusts the dials on his console, his heart hammering against his ribs. He can hear the real enemy armor moving in the distance, a low, guttural growl that vibrates in his teeth. He counters it by playing back the sound of a bridge being built under the cover of darkness. To an adversary listening through the fog, the sounds are indistinguishable from a real invasion. The psychological impact of hearing an army you cannot see is a weapon more potent than any artillery shell, but it is also a beacon. By playing these sounds, Miller is screaming his location to every enemy battery within 20 miles. He is inviting a rain of steel upon a position protected by nothing but plywood and canvas. The third layer is the most subtle and perhaps the most dangerous: radio deception. In a cramped truck parked a mile back, a young man named Arthur monitors the airwaves. Every military unit has a fist, a unique rhythm and style that a radio operator uses when sending Morse code. The adversary's intelligence officers are trained to recognize these individual patterns to track the movement of specific divisions across the continent. Arthur is a master of mimicry. He has spent weeks learning the fist of an operator from the 75th Infantry Division. Now, as the real 75th moves silently toward a secret objective, Arthur stays behind to transmit fake messages, pretending to be them. He broadcasts mundane reports, fake orders, and scrambled coordinates, creating a digital fog of war. He knows that if he slips up, if his rhythm falters for even a second, the enemy will realize the 75th is gone, and the entire Allied flank will be exposed. He taps the key with sweat-slicked fingers, feeling the weight of thousands of lives in every dot and dash. The tension reaches a breaking point in the summer of 1944, as the unit moves into a position near the front lines in France. The Ghost Army is operating just hundreds of yards from the opposing forces. One night, the silence is shattered by the clicking of gears. Two French civilians on bicycles wander into a field of inflatable tanks. Jack freezes, his hand dropping to the side of his fake tank. The civilians stare, eyes wide, at the massive line of armor. One of them reaches out to touch a tread. If they realize it's rubber, word could reach the enemy in hours. The air feels heavy, electric. Jack steps out of the shadows, puffing out his chest, acting the part of a battle-hardened sergeant. He bellows at them in broken, aggressive French, ordering them to move along for their own safety, gesturing wildly toward the danger of the tree line. He watches them pedal away, praying they saw what he wanted them to see, a terrifying force of steel, not a collection of toys. The soldiers live in this constant state of hypervigilance, a paper wall standing in the way of a sledgehammer. Every civilian, every stray dog, is a potential leak in the dam. There is a specific kind of dread that comes with being a decoy. You are essentially a target that is meant to be hit. The goal is to draw fire away from others, which means your success is measured by how much danger you can attract to yourself. As the moon rises higher, the first enemy shells begin to fall. The ground shakes, and the air is filled with the screaming whistle of incoming artillery. Jack huddles in his shallow trench, the irony of his situation bitter in his mouth. The enemy is firing at his rubber tanks, which means his deception is working perfectly. But the shrapnel is very real. A piece of jagged steel rips through an inflatable truck 20 yards away, and the vehicle sighs, its front end sagging into the mud with a pathetic, whistling sound. Jack watches as his hard work deflates into a heap of useless fabric. He realizes that if the enemy keeps firing, they will eventually notice that their targets aren't exploding, they are just disappearing. The smell of burning rubber fills the air, a sickeningly sweet scent that marks the death of the illusion. The darker side of this work is the loneliness of the lie. Jack and Miller can never tell their comrades in other units what they are doing. To the rest of the army, they look like a disorganized group of misfits with strange equipment. They are often ridiculed by infantrymen who see them carrying heaters and speakers instead of heavy machine guns. They carry the weight of the war's outcome on their shoulders but are forbidden from claiming any of the glory. Even as they save lives by diverting the adversary away from vulnerable flanks, they must remain in the shadows. The psychological toll of being a professional deceiver is heavy. You begin to wonder if anything you see is real, or if the entire world is just another layer of the illusion you helped create. You look at your own rifle and wonder if the firing pin is even real, or if you were just another prop in a play you didn't write. This existential dread is the constant companion of the Ghost Army. The climax of their gamble comes at the Rhine River. The mission is to convince the defending forces that the main crossing will happen at a specific point, drawing their heavy defenses away from the actual invasion site. The Ghost Army sets up hundreds of decoys and Miller's speakers blast the sounds of massive construction for 3 straight nights. They create a spectacle of activity so convincing that the opposing side moves an entire division to counter a threat that doesn't exist. Jack spends 48 hours straight painting fake serial numbers on trucks to suggest a massive logistical buildup. He is exhausted, his eyes bloodshot, his mind spinning. The sound of the real artillery barrage starting miles away is the only signal that they have one. When the rail crossing occurs, it is met with almost no resistance. Thousands of lives are saved that day, not through the use of force, but through the mastery of the mind. Yet, as the smoke clears and the real soldiers move forward, the Ghost Army quietly packs up their rubber tanks. There are no medals for the men who weren't there. The secrecy didn't end when the conflict did. For over 40 years, the members of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were bound by an oath of silence. Jack returned to his studio in New York, becoming a successful commercial artist, but he never spoke of the nights in the French mud. His children grew up thinking their father had spent the war behind a desk. They never knew that the man who painted quiet landscapes in his studio had once held the line against a division using nothing but a paintbrush and a dream. It wasn't until the mid-1990s that the records were finally declassified, and the world learned of the men who fought a war with shadows. The survivors were elderly by then, their memories of the inflatable tanks fading like the air that once filled them. The silence they kept for decades was perhaps the greatest deception of all. The legacy of the Ghost Army is a chilling reminder of how easily the human mind can be manipulated. In an era where information is a critical asset, their story is more relevant than ever. They prove that what we perceive as reality is often just a carefully constructed narrative, designed to lead us toward a specific conclusion. They operated in the gray area between truth and fiction, a space where the stakes are life and death. The dark thriller of their existence wasn't just about the danger of the front lines, but the danger of the lie itself. If you can be convinced that a balloon is a tank, what else can you be convinced of? We look at the great movements of the past and see the steel and the stone, but we rarely see the artists in the trenches, carefully painting the shadows. They pioneered techniques that are still used today, though the tools have shifted from rubber and records to algorithms and digital manipulation. The core principle remains the same: exploit the gap between what is sensed and what is understood. By saturating the environment with false signals, they created a reality that the adversary had no choice but to react to. In the world of high-stakes conflict, the one who controls the narrative controls the outcome. The Ghost Army was the first to prove that you don't need to defeat an opponent physically if you can defeat them mentally before the first shot is even fired. As the years pass, the survivors have taken their first-hand accounts of those tense nights with them. But the story remains a haunting testament to the power of human ingenuity under pressure. It is a story of artists who found a way to use their craft to preserve life rather than just reflect it. They turned the tools of creation into tools of strategic deception, blending the beautiful with the terrifying. The final irony of the Ghost Army is that their greatest success was their own invisibility. They were so good at being ghosts that the world forgot they existed. Their missions were successful because nobody knew they were there, and for 50 years, history followed suit. But even now, when we look at photographs of those inflatable tanks, there is something deeply unsettling about them. They are hollow, empty things that look like harbingers of destruction. They are metaphors for the uncertainty of the world we inhabit. We see a shape in the fog and we assume we know what it is, but we rarely stop to ask if there is anything behind the paint. The deception was so perfect that it even fooled the future. The tanks might be gone, but the shadows they cast are longer than ever. The next time you hear a distant rumble in the night, or see a shadow that doesn't quite match the object casting it, remember the men who stood in the French mud with nothing but rubber and air. Remember Jack, Miller, and Arthur, the men who sat in foxholes listening to the whistle of real artillery, hoping that the adversary's aim was just off enough to keep them alive, but close enough to prove the deception was working. It was a macabre dance with mortality, where the only way to win was to make the other side want to destroy you. The Ghost Army reminds us that the most powerful forces in the world aren't always the ones that make the loudest noise or carry the biggest guns. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing is the silence that follows when you realize you've been fighting a ghost. The art of the ghost remains, woven into the fabric of modern conflict. In the shadows of every struggle, there are those who build the illusions we take for granted. They are the architects of the unseen, and in the end, we are all just spectators in a theater of shadows, trying to decide what is real and what is merely a well-placed decoy in the dark.